Hello, everyone. This is Professor DePaulo. Welcome you back to Abnormal Psychology. Uh, this week, we're going to be doing Chapter 3, which is Models of Abnormality. This is basically the different theoretical perspectives which we use to treat a diagnosed mental disorder. So, we're going to start by looking at the biological model, which is basically the neuroscience approach to mental illness. And the biological model or the neuroscientific approach adopts a medical perspective. So they believe that mental illness is solely the result of basically something gone wrong in terms of a biological process, like abnormal amounts of neurotransmitters in the brain, which are basically electrochemical signals that the brain secretes and sends to different areas of the body. It also could involve hormonal issues, which is an endocrine problem. But basically, the brain and the related systems are what's gone wrong, and that's causing the mental illness. So the mental illness is caused by some biological process. And we know this to be the case because you've seen it with the case of Phineas Gage when he had the frontal lobotomy, the accidental frontal lobotomy, where he had basically impulse control issues afterwards. So that's a brain problem. We see this in if you have any kind of traumatic brain injury, it's usually associated with some kind of pathology, some kind of mental disorder. Uh, Now, it's not all biology. Obviously there's nature versus nurture, so you have a mix of other factors as well. But some people, including most psychiatrists, believe that mental disorders are solely a function of brain chemistry issues. So, how do biological theorists explain abnormal behavior? We know that the brain has more than 100 billion nerve cells, they're called neurons, and thousands of billions of support cells called the glia. And the neurons are responsible for communication, the glia are responsible for nourishing the neurons, forming the myelin sheath of the axon, etc., to speed up neurotransmission. And we know that when you put neurons together, you form, you know, more and more tissues, and then that leads to distinct brain regions. And eventually you'll get to the different lobes of the brain. That's on the macro level. This is what a neuron looks like. You have a cell body where the organelles are located. That's the basically the metabolic center of the cell, the energy producing center of the nerve cell. You have dendrites, which are short projections. The dendrites are responsible for receiving signals. So they receive neurochemical signals from other neurons. The axon, there's a singular axon. That singular axon is responsible for generating a nerve signal. I don't want to say nerve signal. It's an action potential. A nerve would be bundles and bundles of neurons. Bundles and bundles of axons would form a nerve fiber. But the singular axon generates uh, generates a neurochemical signal called an action potential, and that sends the information to the synaptic cleft, which is this end of the axon you see here. It says nerve ending. Inside that synapse, you have a bunch of neurotransmitters. Once that action potential is generated, those neurotransmitters get released. And those neurotransmitters get released into the synaptic space. The synapse is the space between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite or the receiving site of another neuron. And you see that space, there's receptor sites on the receiving neuron, and those neurotransmitters need to fit into those receptor sites. And once they bind to the receptor sites, that can either be excitatory or inhibitory. If it's excitatory, it causes the adjacent neuron to depolarize and send out an action potential, and it becomes a chain reaction. If that signal is inhibitory, if those neurotransmitters are inhibitory, that causes that adjacent neuron to do nothing, to stay at rest. And so we need basically a balance of excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission to basically regulate our moods properly. So researchers have identified dozens of neurotransmitters. Those are those electrochemical signals that are being stored in the axon terminal. Examples include serotonin, dopamine, GABA. Some of these are excitatory, so dopamine is mainly excitatory. Serotonin can be both excitatory and inhibitory, and then GABA is very much inhibitory. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid, and it basically slows everything down. So in the case of certain disorders, you can have an imbalance of neurotransmitters. For example, in depression, you're thought to have a low level of serotonin and a low level of norepinephrine, which is another excitatory neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. So if you have low levels of both of those, you're thought to have, that's thought to be leading to depression. For example, anxiety is thought to be having low levels of GABA. Now, it's not a one-to-one function, so there's a lot more going on here than just neurotransmitters, but that's what they believe is going on in the brain, and that's what's being targeted with drugs. Researchers also look at the endocrine system, which is hormonal, and they have found that there's abnormal levels of cortisol that's being linked to anxiety and mood disorders. And cortisol is the major stress hormone. So it's thought that if you're continuously under stress, you're secreting cortisol, you keep secreting cortisol, and that excess cortisol can lead to anxiety and mood disorders. So it's not just neurotransmitters, which are electrochemical signals. You can also have alterations in hormone levels that can trigger mental illness. And once again, this is just a biological perspective. That doesn't mean that other things are not influencing the development of a mental disorder. But if you're a biological theorist or you're a psychiatrist who's primarily concerned about biology, you're going to be looking at drugs that alter the effects of these neurotransmitters and hormones. We also have genetic differences. Now, the problem with genetic differences are there are so many genes that are possibly linked to psychological disorders that it's hard to say that one particular or a sequence of particular genes can be leading to, say, depression. It's probably an inordinate amount, a ton of different genes that could be triggering depression. Not one, not two, not like three, or a small number. Now, each cell in the human body contains 23 pairs of chromosomes, and on each chromosome you have many, many genes that code for a variety of traits that the person has. Could some of these genes play a role in mental disorders? Of course. Can we map that? No. I mean, it's not happening. I mean, could you map a couple of genes to, say, depression or schizophrenia or something else like that? Yeah, of course, you can map a couple of genes. But we're talking about many, many gene combinations that are probably at the root of these disorders. And right now, we are not capable of mapping out all those combinations. So the idea that we can do like gene therapy, it's not happening. We are sort of at the very basic levels of looking at the human genome. So we've mapped the human genome, but we're not really aware of what all these genes do. We know there's many genes and we know the functions of some of them, but when it comes to mental health, there's a lot more questions than there are answers. In the future, could we target genes as a treatment? Possibly, but that's not around the corner anytime soon. We're still targeting neurotransmitters right now. I think it's cleaner to target genes. It might be more effective to target genes. The problem is if you screw up and you target the wrong gene, you might make problems worse for somebody. So we need a lot more research on this. As far as what genes could do, a psychological disorder could be linked to a mutation of a gene. just like cancer is. So cancer is basically due to mutation that has not corrected itself. Because basically, our mutated genes can be corrected. But as we get older, we don't correct those genes as much, right? So there's more likelihood of mutation, and the mutation will stay, and that mutation can cause a problem. So in cancer, we know there's mutations all over the place, and some of those mutations are really serious that we can actually measure. We haven't done that for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, OCD, etc. We're a lot further along with gene therapy for, say, cancer than we are for mental illness. And one of the reasons for that is because there's tons of more money in cancer research than there is in mental health. I mean, it's not even worth talking about. Mental health funding is very limited, whereas funding for cancer is astronomical. So if we had more funding, like the cancer people have, we can then really map genes more effectively. We'd be much further advanced, but unfortunately, there's not much funding in mental health. And the bottom line is the stigma, the fact that people with mental health problems are not dying. That's a big difference. You know, you hear the word cancer, you freak out, you think someone's going to die, and you want to give money to it. Or you know someone that has died from cancer. And it seems more urgent. When you think depression, yeah, someone could die from suicide, but you don't have that same kind of urgency when you say, oh, this person has depression, then this person has this kind of cancer. You know, this person has lung cancer, this person has pancreatic cancer. Now it's like, wow, that's crazy, that's serious. We got to fund this as much as possible. We got to give people hope. Whereas, you know, with someone with depression, they're like, oh, well, doesn't everybody have depression? Well, it's not that big of a deal. I've had depression already. I dealt with it. Why do we need to fund this? So those are issues with funding. That's the number one issue. Could be a result of evolution. So mental illness could be a result of evolution in that, look at anxiety. What causes anxiety? Well, we could say a gene or a combination of genes, genes code for neurotransmitters, neurotransmitter imbalance, et cetera, right? And why is that occurring? Why do people have anxiety? And I may say, well, people have anxiety because anxiety is an adaptive mechanism through evolution. It's beneficial to have anxiety. Well, what's beneficial about it? I mean, it just screws up your life. You know, you can't function on the job well, you can't sleep, it messes up your life. So why would evolution, you know, allow for anxiety to continue? Well, anxiety has benefits in some cases. It can increase survival. So if you're out gathering, this is the example I always give with regard to genetics, hunter-gatherer days. You need to go hunt for food. You know, let's go back thousands of years to our ancestors. Well, if you're hunting for food and you come across a bear, you see that bear, you have no anxiety. And you just say, okay, there's the bear. I'm just going to ignore the bear and continue to go about getting my food, hunting. And I won't pay no mind to this bear. Well, guess what? You're going to have a problem. You're probably going to end up dead. But if you go out, you know, talking about our ancestors during hunter-gatherer days, you go out and you're hunting for food and you see the bear, and all of a sudden you feel extreme anxiety and you need to go in the other way. It kicks in the fight or flight response. And obviously fight's the wrong answer. So you see the bear, you want to run. You run in the opposite direction. Well, guess what happens when you run in the opposite direction from the bear? You get to live another day. You survive. And if you survive, you procreate. And you pass on that response to your offspring. And so now anxiety is being selected for because it helped you survive. So something like anxiety is beneficial. to our ancestors for survival purposes. Now, for us, it's not really too beneficial. Very rarely does anxiety allow us to survive. Maybe it does under extreme circumstances, but not normal everyday life. So it's kind of a remnant from the past that, just causes us problems. But it was selected for through evolution. Similar to like your wisdom teeth, which is another example that I always bring up in my classes. Because I've had this debate with dentists. You go for your dental procedure, you're like all nervous, you want it to be over with. I go for my dental procedure, I'm like talking to the dentist or the oral surgeon and asking about the evolutionary viability of wisdom teeth, which is kind of crazy, but that's just kind of on my mind. And so I'm having these debates with dentists and oral surgeons about, why do we have to get our wisdom teeth removed? Well, they don't serve any biological function right now. But back, if you go back hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, I would say more like thousands of years ago, we ate a much rougher, high fiber diet that required extra mastication, chewing, and our wisdom teeth were beneficial for that. Now, recently, if you're going to eat McDonald's for lunch, you don't require wisdom teeth because McDonald's has no fiber content. It's very easy to eat. And you digest it, it's, white flour and, some version of meat. Or a salad, right? But you're not eating like a real difficult meal where you're consuming like products of the earth, which are not easily digestible, which require a lot more force to break down when you chew it. In the 21st century, 21st century, we don't require that. All of our meals are fairly easy to chew these days, for the most part. So the wisdom tooth plays no part, wisdom teeth, because we have multiple wisdom teeth. As a result, people are starting to be born without wisdom teeth through natural selection. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. I had my wisdom teeth, and they caused all kinds of problems, and I had to have them taken out, or they were coming in different. They come in sideways, they come in, they're a nightmare for most people. But some people are being born without their wisdom teeth because they don't need them. From an evolutionary point of view, they're useless now. So if you have them taken out, no big deal, right? You don't need them. So that's kind of how evolution works. It's a really slow process. And although we don't really need anxiety too much these days, it's going to be a very slow process for us to lose anxiety, for anxiety to not be selected for. And there are certain occasions in modern times that we do need anxiety, so I'd find it really hard for it to be selected against. But that's kind of the genetic aspect of, we have genes that code for these disorders, but we also have evolutionary principles that select for these disorders. And sometimes they select for things we don't need anymore, like anxiety and wisdom teeth. So that fear response was really adaptive, but now not so adaptive. It used to be beneficial that you had the anxiety response, as I said before, but now you're at work and you're having a panic attack and you're wondering what's the evolutionary benefit of anxiety, extreme anxiety. And the answer is nothing right now, maybe for your ancestors, but you having a panic attack at work or at school is not going to benefit you in any way. I don't even look at panic attack as kind of evolution. I look at it as kind of a false alarm, like the brain has kind of gone haywire. But these extreme fear reactions, anxiety reactions, are not beneficial anymore. We just have them because they were beneficial in the past. So blame your ancestors. if you have anxiety that kind of, stops you from doing things you want to do sometimes. That's all your ancestors' fault. Go back thousands of years ago, there's your problem. There are some biological causes that tend to be viral as well. So we've talked about neurotransmitters, we've talked about evolution, we've talked about genes, and viral infections can account for schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is associated with prenatal viral exposure, like the flu. You get the flu while you're pregnant, there's a higher probability that your child could go on to develop schizophrenia. Now, it's not a fait accompli. It's not that if you got a virus and you got the flu and you're doomed. No, but they've noticed that these children, when they're born, if they were exposed to a virus in utero, they had a little bit of a higher chance of developing schizophrenia. So let's look at biological treatments. So we've talked about biological causes. Once we've determined that there's a problem, could be biological, could not be biological, it doesn't matter, but you have some kind of disorder, what are some of the biological treatments to correct these disorders? The most popular one is drug therapy. So psychiatrists, this is their bread and butter. This is basically all they do these days is they write you scripts. Does it work? Well, yeah, it could work. Could also not work. Could also lead to side effects. Could also lead to dependency. So it's not like drugs are like the perfect answer, because they're not. They're very good in terms of a crisis. They can stabilize someone. In case of severe illness, they're helpful. But they're not that helpful in sort of garden variety cases of depression and anxiety, for instance. They're not the universal answer. You take this pill, you're guaranteed to feel better. Not necessarily. They can be helpful though, in the short term. In the long term, not as much. So drug therapy, there's pitfalls, there's advantages of it. I think it's useful in the short term. I think it becomes problematic in the long term, for some people especially. Electroconvulsive therapy. This is more extreme than drug therapy. This is electroshock therapy for severe depression, mainly. In some other countries, they use it for schizophrenia. Electroconvulsive therapy is really intense. Is it effective for very bad depression? It can be. But basically, you're inducing a seizure in someone by altering the electrical current in the brain. So I like to think of electroconvulsive therapy like, when your computer doesn't work, you like reboot it, you power it on and off, and you like hope that the problem goes away. That's electroconvulsive therapy. It's like rebooting your brain. We don't know exactly how it works. Just like when you reboot your computer, you have no idea how it worked. You just fixed it, and you really don't care at the time. Electroconvulsive therapy, we really don't know how it works, but it just sometimes fixes things. So in a case of severe depression, this is an option, especially if drug therapy fails. It's an extreme option because there are a lot of side effects with it, but it's something that does work in a dire situation. And then psychosurgery, that's effective for certain disorders like OCD, if it's extreme. They've also done some psychosurgery for depression. It's, this is like the extreme. I think this is even further extreme than ECT because it's very invasive. You're either putting electrodes in the brain or you're removing part of the brain. Not lobotomy, where you're like, lobotomies are removing like a lobe. Here you might be removing a small segment of a part of the brain that you might feel is overactive. Psychosurgery is very invasive. It's brain surgery. So if you do it, and their side effects, you can't undo it. So you have to be really certain that you're going to engage in this procedure. Like you've hit the dead end. Nothing has worked, and you're at a loss, and you can't live the way you're living, and this is an option. Not something that would be taken lightly, though. It's a last resort. Drug therapy came online in the 1950s, and it really led to the end of mass hospitalization. So it led to much more outpatient treatment. And it was very effective for anxiety, depression, was effective for people with bipolar, and of course, schizophrenics. So these drug classes, the anti-anxiety drugs, the antidepressant drugs, the mood stabilizers, and the antipsychotics really changed the way that we treat mental illness. And drug therapy has been a boon for basically millions upon millions of people. And for some people, it's essential. They have to have drug therapy. But there are, problems like with anything else. There are always issues when you go about a treatment. There are side effects. As I mentioned, electroconvulsive therapy, very extreme. You're inducing a seizure in hopes that you can treat severe depression. But let me repeat that again. You're inducing a seizure. That's how extreme it is. And we're talking about sending people for 8, 9, 10 treatments, which is like 8, 9, 10 seizures. We don't even know how it works. It does work in some cases, in extreme cases. But, you're inducing a seizure, so it's kind of crazy. That's how I think of it. It's really crazy that you have to induce a seizure to stop someone's severe depression. Does it work? Of course. In some cases it works well, but when you induce a seizure, there's going to be side effects. And those side effects can be not very pleasant. And then the psychosurgery started with trephination. It moved into lobotomy. Trephination is drilling the hole in the skull. That was what we talked about in chapter 1. That was done in ancient times. And you can find cadavers in ancient Egypt with holes drilled in their skull. So it was practiced as far back as 5000 BC. Lobotomy was practiced going back to the 1930s. That was removal of a lobe, usually the frontal lobe. Once again, that's an extreme procedure, not done today. Causes an abundance of symptoms, a lot of unpleasant symptoms. So lobotomy, not very effective for treating mental illness. Trephination, not very effective. Actually, never performed now. And really, no one performs lobotomy anymore either. These are techniques that have been cast out. Could you do psychosurgery and do like a deep brain stimulation or do a singulectomy for OCD? Of course. So there are brain treatments for mental illness. They're just not as radical as, say, lobotomy. I mean, trephination is really radical too, but lobotomy is extreme. Removing a frontal lobe of a patient is just, it's butchering them. You turn them into a vegetable half the time. That means they're in a persistent vegetative state. They're just kind of like sitting there drooling and not functioning. People can't function with a frontal lobe removed. Look at Phineas Gage. His frontal lobe was severely damaged. He didn't function well. So why would you use that as a treatment? It's fairly barbaric. Thankfully, we've moved on from these, barbarisms of the past that we'll never see again because they're just awful. They're hard to imagine how this would benefit anybody. So, strengths of the biological model. There's a lot of respect because psychiatry operates through the biological model. It's also something that seems like scientific. So you have that like sort of scientific credibility for it. It produces a lot of information. So the new surgeries, the different drug treatments, techniques, it's beneficial to a lot of people. There's lots of side effects as well. I'm not going to say it's perfect. Treatments can bring great relief, but treatments also can be problematic. So it goes both ways. Weaknesses are it's too simple. I mean, how can you say a mental illness is just down to neurotransmitters? That seems oversimplistic. I mean, shouldn't we look at environment, rather than just neurotransmitters? And of course, as I mentioned numerous times, side effects. Lots of side effects. The psychodynamic model. This is the oldest and most famous psychological model of mental illness, developed by Sigmund Freud in the 19th century. Sigmund Freud was a medical doctor, and he developed his theory of psychoanalysis based on his interactions with his patients, and also based on analysis of his daughter Anna Freud. Abnormal symptoms, or mental illness, basically, is the result of conflict among unconscious forces. We all know what those unconscious forces are. They're the id, the ego, and the superego. And they're constantly in balance with each other. And any kind of conflict there can lead to mental illness. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to resolve the unconscious conflicts, which means that you're not aware of these conflicts, but they exist, and you need to resolve them because they're creating an imbalance between these three components of consciousness, the id, the ego, and superego. The id is guided by the pleasure principle. That basically means it wants pleasure all the time, doesn't care about anything else, has no delayed gratification. The id is your instinctual needs, your impulses, your drives. It's also sexual. Think of it as sexual and aggressive. Sexual, it's fueled by the libido, which is your sexual energy. So the id could be saying, I want this, I want this, I want this, in terms of sex, right? It wants to satisfy these sexual impulses, these aggressive impulses also. However, we can't always express them. We don't live in a society where you can just consciously express your id because it's aggressive and sexual drives. If you express them, you'd probably be in jail. So you need to sort of keep that under control. That's why you have the other components that are fighting against the id. You have the ego. The ego is guided by the reality principle. So it thinks about, can I do this in our current society? So it looks at our society and says, how much can I let the id have its way? And when do I have to throttle down the id? So the ego seeks gratification, but it kind of puts a hold on our id running wild, basically. So when can we let the id express its impulses, and when can we throttle it back? Stop it from exerting its will. And the ego does this also through a bunch of defense mechanisms. These defense mechanisms protect us from anxiety. And the anxiety is caused by the id. So these defense mechanisms are a way of coping with the id, basically. Here are some of their ego defense mechanisms. Repression, which is pushing something into the unconscious. So this is something that's, painful, or, something you don't want to think about, you don't want to be aware of. So that it generates anxiety. So the ego says, okay, I know how to deal with this. Push it into the unconscious. So you're not aware of it. Denial is another one. Denial is when you refuse to acknowledge an actual, a reality, which is a source of anxiety. You have a final exam and you say, well, it's not that important. I'm going to go to the movies. And if you went to the movies and you thought the exam was important, what would happen? You get really anxious. So denial is a way of, getting rid of this anxiety. It's basically saying, okay, your id wants to do what it wants to do. Your id wants to go to the movies. Your id wants to go have fun. And I guess the way I'll cope with this is to say that, there's not going to be any consequences of having fun. Because the exam you have is not important. That's denial. Projection is when you feel something and you attribute it to someone else because it makes you feel uncomfortable. So you're really angry. So you're really, really angry, and so then you attribute it to your significant other. I'm not the one that's angry. You're the one that's angry. So I'm sure you've had that conversation before. You're not happy with your relationship, and it's too anxiety provoking to say that you've done something wrong, that you're to blame for this. Doesn't make you feel good. So you project it onto your partner. Why are you looking to cheat on me? And your partner's like, what? I'm not cheating on you. But you're the one that was actually thinking about cheating. But you've projected it onto your partner because it makes you feel better by doing that. It reduces your anxiety. So that's projection. Then rationalization is when you dismiss something out of hand. So you got a bad grade on your test. Oh, my professor is terrible. No one could do well with this professor. It's not your fault that you didn't study for it. It's not your fault that you never asked a question. It's just your professor's fault. That's rationalization. You've made an illegitimate excuse for something to make yourself feel better. Then you have displacement. This is when you have a negative emotion and you displace it onto a safer substitute. So a good example of this is you're angry at your boss. So when you get home at night, because you can't say anything to your boss because you don't want to get fired, but you're really angry at your boss. You wish you could yell, scream, punch your boss, etc. So you get home, you start arguing with your significant other. Why? Because your significant other is a safer target than your boss. So you've displaced that anger from your boss to your significant other. Makes you feel better. If you're angry at your boss, you can't really say anything because you might lose your job. But your partner is a safer substitute in most cases. Intellectualization is kind of like rationalization, but you're using extreme logic to deal with a problem. So a woman who has been beaten and raped gives a detached description of the effects that such attacks may have on victims. So instead of talking about her personal ordeal, she talks about rapes in the U.S. What are the negative effects of rapes in the U.S.? Instead of talking about her own personal situation because it's too painful. So she's kind of not dealing with her own issues by making it, some logical argument about the effect of rape in the community. That's intellectualization. And then regression is going back to an earlier stage of existence, developmental stage. So if you have a boy that can't cope with anger towards his mother, he'll regress to infantile behavior, he'll soil his clothes, and he won't take care of his basic needs. So he's going back to an earlier stage of development because this is how he's dealing with his anger towards his rejecting mother. Or you have a kid that will, whenever they get stressed, they'll start sucking their thumb. And we're talking about like kids in high school. So they're not like young children. but they'll, it'll be like a comforting mechanism. They'll start sucking on their thumb, and it's like they were a child. And this is the way they're dealing with their stress and regulating their emotions. That's regression, when you go back to an earlier stage of development due to extreme anxiety or stress. So these are just some of the defense mechanisms. And these are mechanisms that the ego uses to deal with anxiety that's mainly coming from the id. So we have the id, which is the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants now. It doesn't care about society. It doesn't care about consequences. And then you have the ego, which is kind of like, okay, I'm going to worry about what is society going to tell us? How much can the id express itself? And if there's a lot of anxiety from the id, how do I deal with that anxiety? Through defense mechanisms. And then you have the superego, which is guided by the morality principle. And this is generally adapted from your parents. So the superego develops after the resolution of the Oedipal complex. And what the superego does basically is it tells you what is morally right and morally wrong. And it's generally developed through your parents because at the end of the Oedipal complex, you look at your parents as a role model. And the Oedipal complex is this idea that when, young boys, they want to be like their father, right? They look at their father as a role model, but they also want to be like their father. They're attracted to their mothers, and they see their father as a rival. Right? So they have an improper desire for the mother. They see their father as a rival, but they won't pursue the mother because they're afraid of the father. They're afraid that the father will castrate them if the father finds this out, that they have a desire for the mother. So instead of dealing with this, instead of taking the chance and having the father castrate them, they decide, okay, I'm not going to have any desire for the mother. I'm going to be like my father. And I'm not going to challenge my father. I'm going to give in. I'm going to be like him. He's going to be a role model. And this is the development of the superego based off of this resolution of the Oedipal complex. And it's guided by the morality principle. So what is right and what is wrong? And obviously that might be in contrast to what the id wants. So the id is on the subway and the id sees, an attractive person, and the id is telling you basically, I want to have sex with this person now. Right? So now the id wants that. You know that's not appropriate. Why do you know that's not appropriate? Because you got the ego. The ego says, wait a minute, like, you can't just do this. I work on the reality principle, and in reality, you can't do this. You'll go to jail. You need to go through the proper courtship mechanism. And the superego might come along and say, yeah, that's completely right because it's amoral. It's not moral to be, sexually assaulting someone against their will. So now you need to resolve the conflict between the superego and the id. And the ego is the one that's trying to say, okay, I want the id to get what it wants to a degree, but I want to make sure that it's morally okay, and I want to make sure it fits with our societal view of things. So it's kind of, the ego is kind of in the middle. The ego is like a referee. Referees the conflict between the id, the superego, and society in general, right? How does this fit with society? So they're always in contrast. Basically, they're always trying to deal with the id. It's like the id is like a runaway train. The id just wants what it wants. It doesn't care. It doesn't want, it's going to take what it wants, ask questions later. And it's not going to ask questions because it doesn't care. I want this, I want that, I want this, and I want it now. And I don't care what anyone tells me, it's going to happen. You can't live your life with unrestrained id. So that's why the ego and the superego are there to balance it out. This is not moral, right? That's the superego. Ego says this is not going to fit within the context of society, and they stop the id. But that can generate anxiety, and that's why you have the defense mechanisms. When there's anxiety generated from the id, especially when it's in conflict with these other forces, the defense mechanisms deal with this anxiety. But they're always in conflict. And a healthy personality allows there to be balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. An unhealthy personality is when there's no balance. If you have too much id, you're going to have a problem, right? You're going to be getting what you want when you want it. You're not going to be able to delay gratification. You're not going to be able to accept no as an answer from anyone. You may get in a problem with the law because you're not able to control your impulses, your sexual or aggressive impulses. So if you're all id, it's a big problem. If you're all superego, then you're not going to express any desire because you're going to be too caught up on, is this morally correct? Can I do this? Should I do this? And so you're not going to act on your impulses at all. And that's going to be a problem too. So if you're all id, it's a problem. If you're all superego, it's a problem. You need to be a healthy balance. And that requires therapy. That requires psychoanalysis. So Freud thought we went through a series of developmental stages that required adjustments in the id, ego, and superego. If we were successful dealing with our developmental stages, we experienced personal growth. If we were unsuccessful, we became fixated. And these fixations lead to problems later in life. And a lot of times the parents are the source of the fixation and improper development. So you start out in the oral stage between 0 and 18 months. Then you're in the anal stage between 18 months and 3 years. Then you're in the phallic stage between 3 to 5 years. The latency stage between 5 and 12 years. And then the genital stage from 12 years to adulthood. And if you get fixated or stuck, that means you don't appropriately allow the id to be satisfied, right? So basically, you have to allow the id to express itself under control in each of these phases. If you cannot balance it out where you allow the id to get a little bit of what it wants, okay, you end up fixated. For example, the oral stage, you're a baby. The erogenous zone of the oral stage fixates around the mouth. That's why it's called the oral stage. Babies like putting things in their mouths. Now, what if you're a baby and you pick up something off the floor and you put it in your mouth, and your parents yell and scream at you every time you try to put something in your mouth? Well, guess what? Your id is saying, I want oral gratification. I want to suck on something as a baby. I want something in my mouth. And the parents are saying, no, 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 get that out of your mouth. Da, da, da. You know, they're screaming and yelling. The child may be conflicted that they can't meet the needs, the oral gratification needs of the id during this stage. So they become fixated at the oral stage. Then later in life, since they're fixated at the oral stage, they're going to have certain oral fixations, like they might become overeaters because they need to satisfy that oral gratification by constantly feeding themselves. Or they may become smokers. That's another oral fixation because, you know, it's pleasurable to be smoking a cigarette. It provides oral pleasure. So that's the problem with being fixated at the oral stage. If you're fixated at the anal stage is about, you know, proper bladder and bowel processes. So you're toilet trained. If you fail to be adequately toilet trained, then you're going to end up fixated at the anal stage. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. Maybe your parents are rushing you. Like you're trying to use the bathroom when you're a toddler, and your parents are like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And it creates anxiety, and you just end up, not going to the bathroom, and then you end up peeing your pants later on. And then your parents yell at you. We told you to use the bathroom. But you couldn't do it because they didn't give you enough time to do it. So if you're fixated at the anal stage, you've had unsuccessful toilet training experiences. And as an adult, you end up becoming perfectionistic. You become very controlling because you never had control over these basic biological functions as a toddler. Now in your everyday life as an adult, you want extreme control. You become a very controlling person. You become a micromanager. And that's not good. And that can lead to conflict in your adult relationships. So each of these stages has a fixation that you can be stuck at. And if you're stuck at it, you don't resolve the conflict, you don't satisfy the impulses at each stage, you can end up with problems later in life, basically. Psychodynamic therapies, these range from Freudian psychoanalysis, which is the traditional therapy that was developed in the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. So this was what Freud was doing with his patients in an outpatient setting. To modern psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So the modern therapy is generally called psychodynamic, and modern psychodynamic therapy can be also brief psychodynamic therapy. So it could be something that's similar to what a CBT is like, cognitive behavioral therapy, which we haven't talked about yet, but it's kind of like a short intervals. Whereas traditional psychoanalysis revolves around the id, and the id is thought to be sexual and aggressive in nature. Modern psychodynamic therapies have less sexuality involved. So they're less about sexuality and they're more about dynamics, relationships. So you don't have to worry about being fixated at a particular stage because of the id. With traditional psychoanalysis, yes, you have to worry about the id, you have to worry about the libido. With modern psychodynamic therapies, it's more about your relationships. What's my relationship with my siblings, my parents, my partner? What's my attachment style? All of that plays a role in the modern psychodynamic psychotherapy. So it's like a less sexualized version. It's also a lot less intense. So traditional psychoanalysis is 3 times a week for many years. Could be for your whole life. Whereas modern psychodynamic therapies are usually once a week for a shortened period of time. So there's a big difference. And some of the modern approaches are object relations therapy. You have Adlerian therapy. You have attachment style, the stuff revolving around attachment. Those are more modern psychodynamic therapies. You have ego psychology. There's a bunch of other ones too. They're like the sex has been removed from the pure psychoanalytic therapy. Now, traditional Freudian psychoanalysis is still used today, especially in New York City. It's used all the time. It tends to be very expensive too. Is one better than the other? It depends on what you're comfortable with. It depends on how much money you have. The insurance companies do not like to pay for traditional psychoanalysis because they feel like they haven't been studied. They don't know if it works because there's no research on the long-term efficacy of it. So they'll pay for the psychodynamic therapy, but they won't pay for traditional psychoanalysis. I know people that practice both therapies, the newer psychodynamic and the traditional psychoanalysis. They don't agree with each other, obviously. They can be very effective, both therapies. So it's hard for me to say which one is better or not. I think it depends on how much commitment, how much money you have to put towards it. They all seek to uncover past trauma, inner conflict, the conflict especially in childhood, because that's the basis of all the conflict in both psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies. Childhood conflict is huge. And can you work through it? Can the therapist help you process the issues you had as a child? And if you can resolve that now, these are mostly issues that have been repressed, that have been pushed out of consciousness, or dealt with in another way in terms of a defense mechanism. And can you deal with it effectively now with the therapist's help? And if you go back and you resolve those childhood conflicts, it should help resolve the adult problems that you're dealing with currently. It utilizes various techniques, including free association. This is very common with traditional psychoanalysis. Free association is when you say whatever's on your mind. So I may give you a word, and then you have to basically say anything on your mind, regardless of how ridiculous it sounds. And that's supposed to allow the unconscious to slip out. So it's kind of allows the unconscious thoughts and desires and conflicts to leak out into consciousness. That's the basis of free association. Now, therapists can also examine the pattern of interactions that the patient and therapist has. So there can be resistance, which is basically when the client or the patient refuses to talk about conflict, acknowledge conflict. So there's nothing wrong with them. There's no conflict, there's no problem, there's no childhood issues. That's resistance. They're not willing to talk about anything. So that tells the therapist that this is an important area to be probed, but if they're not talking about it openly, we need to assess it a different way, like with a projective measure, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Transference is when the client or patient transfers their thoughts and their desires onto the therapist. It can be transference. And then obviously dream interpretation is very important too. The psychoanalysts always do dream interpretation. They look at the hidden meaning of dreams. So through resistance, transference, and dream interpretation, the therapist can help make a diagnosis and sort of set up a treatment plan. There's also a principle of catharsis, which is when the patient basically lets go of the negative emotion. That's catharsis. They just basically let it all out. And psychoanalysts think that's beneficial. And then working through is, in cooperation with your therapist, dealing with aspects, conflicts that you've now identified and processing them in a different manner. Because those childhood conflicts, they stay with you your whole life. And you need to then work through them with the therapist. So the therapist may role play. Therapist may play your mother. And you need to resolve the conflict with the therapist playing your mother and work through the problem. And that could be a long process. Because these childhood conflicts, they're very deeply embedded and they cause problems and they're very difficult. It's a long process to resolve it, to work through it. So the strength of the psychodynamic models or the psychoanalytic models they were the first to recognize psychological problems. With Freud was the first one to develop outpatient psychotherapy. They saw abnormal functioning rooted in the same processes as normal functioning. That's important too. And they they applied theory and technique systematically to treatment. So Freud had a theory, and he applied that theory to the treatment of psychoanalysis. And traditional psychoanalytic theory was one of the first theories I've ever developed that dealt with mental illness. So in that way, Freud was a pioneer. Even though he was a medical doctor, he was a physician, he was a pioneer in developing psychotherapy, even if you disagree with him. And I have plenty of disagreements. I mean, the guy was a pioneer. He is one of the founders of psychotherapy. The weakness is you can't research this. You know, the id, the ego, and the superego, that sounds good, but how do I know they exist? I can't see it. It's unconscious. That means there's no way I can deal with that, right? And I can't research it because you can't measure it. It's unconscious. So it's not observable, it's not researched, it's impossible to prove, it's impossible to disprove. As a result, people get frustrated. They're like, how do I know it works? It's all based on these concepts that I can't measure. And the unconscious. That's another issue. How do I know what's in your unconscious? You don't even know. So how would I know? Through free association? Are you sure? How do I know free association is getting at your unconscious? Because Freud thought it did. How do I know dream interpretation is getting at your unconscious? Because Freud thought it did. That's basically what you're going on. I mean, it's easy to say my dream has some significant meaning, but I can just as easily say my dream is just random. Freud never thought that, though. He thought they all had meaning. They had hidden meanings. And he had to help find the hidden meaning. The Oedipal complex, does it exist? Well, you may not remember it, but Freud would say, you don't remember the Oedipal complex because you pushed it, you repressed it. You pushed it into unconsciousness because it made you feel uncomfortable. So you repressed it. How do I know I repressed it? You don't know. Repression is unconscious. No way you can access it. But Freud was confident you repressed it. So there's a lot here where you have to take like a leap of faith. You have to be okay with it. You have to not. You're not going to have all the answers. You have to believe that it works or it doesn't work. And if you believe that it works, you have to be okay with not having all the answers and not being able to fully test it. Now, does psychoanalysis work? Of course. It works. Even if we can't identify all these things, it works. Is it the most effective way to do therapy? It depends on who you talk to. You know, some people believe it's the only way. Other people think it's, a theory made up by Freud and not heavily tested. And that Freud is very creative. They don't really believe in it too much. So it does work in people, but would another technique work better? I don't know. I think it depends on who you're working with. So I'm not going to discard it like it's a hoax, because it's not. But I also acknowledge that psychoanalysis is impossible to study, and if you want to be able to test a treatment, if you want to be able to measure outcomes, psychoanalysis is a difficult thing to really work with. You have to be very patient. I mean, change is very slow, could take years. Whereas the other techniques, change is not that slow. So psychoanalysis is the most slow-moving. But at the other end, they say, well, yes, it's very slow to make changes through psychoanalysis, but when you make changes, the changes are long-lasting because you're getting at the core of the issue. And the other therapeutic techniques, you're not getting at the core of the issue. You're just trying to patch things up. So you have that perspective as well. Are you getting at the core of the issue that you're going to fix forever? Or, is this patching things up in a very slow manner with psychoanalysis? So there's a great debate over how effective it is. Psychoanalysts basically think their technique is the best and everybody else is flawed. It's not worth even considering anything else. Other therapists that are outside of psychoanalysis, they tend to be more open-minded. It's very difficult to have a conversation with a psychoanalyst to tell them that I don't agree with you, because they're very set in their ways, and they have explanations for all kinds of things that maybe you don't agree with, but since you can't prove or disprove it, there's no point arguing over it. You either believe it or you don't believe it. So that's it for psychoanalysis. It is a very important technique. However, it's also can be also controversial under certain circumstances as well.